Well, longtime Ethiopian ruler and U.S. counterterrorism ally Meles Zenawi has died. The news of his death has caught our attention because of the international response that it's created. UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon said Meles will be remembered for his exceptional leadership and advocacy on African issues within and outside the continent. President Obama added that Meles deserves recognition for his contributions to his country's development, including his unyielding commitment to Ethiopia's poor. Jose Manuel Barroso, president of the European Commission, also offered his condolences, praising him as a respected African leader. So what's interesting about the statements made by world leaders is a lack of attention to a darker side of Zenawi's legacy, the side that includes Ethiopia being criticized for years by human rights groups for the government's strict control. I want to speak more about this with the Answer Coalition's Mike Preisner. Hey there, Mike. First of all, your reaction to some of these other reactions that we're hearing from world leaders about this death.
Well, it's not surprising at all. I mean, the U.S. government is very, very good at telling us who our friends are and who our enemies are, which countries and which leaders they shower with praise, like in this case, and which countries and leaders they denounce and target for regime change based on, so-called human rights violations. And so what we're seeing here is not out of character for the U.S. government, but really the standard where a leader or country is a friend and ally of the U.S. government, not based on the nature of their government or human rights record, but based on whether or not they cooperate with the control of resources in the region.
And another thing, Mike, I mean, that he has been praised for is of getting Ethiopia sort of a little bit out, at least, of the economic slump. He's fast-tracked economic development in that country. Every world leader, it seems, has its flaws. I mean, what do you think is really being hidden about Zenawi?
Sure, and at the same time, political leaders who are actually fighting for real changes for poor people in Ethiopia and real distribution of the vast wealth of the country and the resources of the country, they're in jail right now as political prisoners. I mean, the jails in Ethiopia are flooded with people who did nothing else except stand up to the government, speak out, and try to organize for real justice for the poor people in that country. But, the U.S. government has a lot of interest in Ethiopia, and so that human rights records really wouldn't matter. I mean, massive military base, drone outposts in Ethiopia as well. And really look at the whole of Africa, because we can't look at this just in the context of Ethiopia, but on the entire continent, there is a war going on. And that's a war for the vast mineral resources of the continent. One that's been going on for centuries of colonization by Western powers of the continent. The same colonizers who cared so deeply for the human rights violations in Libya and then had to start a war in Libya. But look at the entire continent, right? And I mean, the U.S. government had a very big campaign, people may remember, about the Darfur region and the so-called genocide that was happening in Darfur. And, these pro-imperialist front groups like Amnesty International, took up this cause. Darfur, where they're saying, hundreds of thousands of people were being killed, although with no evidence, when just 100 miles away in Uganda was the biggest U.S. military base in Africa, from which the Rwandan Popular Front came out of, and these Ugandan and Rwandan militias that were funded and trained and backed by the U.S. government were carrying out the greatest brutality in the entire continent in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where over 5 million people have been killed in the past 10 years. But for some reason, that didn't qualify as a human rights violation, even though the numbers was 35 times the so-called genocide that was being committed in Darfur. It all comes down to who is cooperating with the big banks and with Wall Street about control of resources on the entire continent.
As you may know, Mike, Washington, D.C. has one of the largest Ethiopian communities in this country. And we did go, we paid a visit to that part of town earlier today and got some differing reactions. Take a look.
He is our hero. So his death is very hurtful for me and for my family and for the Ethiopians.
What do you think it means for the people of Ethiopia?
Oh my God. It's gonna be tough. It's gonna be hard on them, on us. It's gonna be hard.
He completely destroyed that country. He just depend on Western aids, and that's all he does.
So interesting, Mike. I mean, just within this one neighborhood in Washington itself, we have tears. The country's going to be terrible without him. And then we have somebody saying he destroyed the country. Talk a little bit about this sort of differing of opinions in the U.S.
Sure. Well, in any country, there's going to be a spectrum of political ideologies and tendencies in one way or the other. I think it would actually be interesting if we asked people from Somalia what they thought about his death. There's actually a big community of Somalians who live in D.C. as well, because it's a people of Somalia who had Ethiopian troops under the orders and backing of the U.S. government come into their country. It's the people in Somalia who are enduring drone strikes on a regular basis that are coming from Ethiopia. And so, it's not even just within the country of Ethiopia where you can see, the human rights violations and crimes, but the entire region that's now under domination and threat of destruction and death and attacks because of this U.S. bastion of interest in Ethiopia.
Well, and we should mention that one of the reasons that those troops went into Somalia for the U.S. was in order to try to help fight al-Qaeda members in Somalia. So a lot of different kind of things going on there. But let's make this a little more broad, Mike. I mean, this is a country in which security forces have been known for killing hundreds of people, imprisoning thousands of others, including on the night of Meles Zenawi's election in 2005. This is not the only country where this happens. You mentioned a couple other African countries. Talk a little bit about the doublespeak, though, that goes on overall.
Sure. Well, overall, if you look at a list of what countries and leaders the U.S. says is its allies and which the U.S. says is its enemies, and they say it's about democracy and human rights, but all it takes is a simple look to see that's absolutely not true. And so the closest allies of the U.S. government are Israel and Colombia and Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, countries with the worst human rights records on the planet, and some that actually have no democracy whatsoever. But the enemies are Cuba and Iran and North Korea. But, the similarities that they have is one is group is independent, refuses to just give away all of its wealth and resources to U.S. corporations, and others collaborate and cooperate with the interests of Wall Street. And I think we should look particularly to right now where this is most significant, and this is in Syria, where the U.S. government is using this idea of human rights violations to say that the Syrian government must be overthrown and there must be a new government that comes in its place. And who is this alliance of countries who are lecturing Syria about human rights violations? It's the United States government, it's Saudi Arabia, and Qatar that are the main proponents. Saudi Arabia and Qatar somehow lecturing Syria on democracy and human rights, both countries that are hereditary police state monarchies that are some of the most brutal and repressive dictatorships on the planet, yet they're somehow able to lecture this other country about how they should run their government and be sending weapons and potentially bombs and soldiers to those countries to overthrow its government. Not to mention the U.S. government, which is the greatest violator of human rights on the planet, with a vast empire occupying multiple countries, at war with multiple countries, bombing and carrying out drone strikes in multiple countries, exposed for carrying out illegal rendition, illegal torture that continues to this day, and within its own borders, a prison population of over 2.2 million people, the highest on the planet. That's not just even per capita, that's by number. So you have the greatest purveyors of human rights violations lecturing others about human rights, but it really all comes down to who is controlling the resources of the region and somehow using this liberal type language to provide a pretext for imperialist intervention.
I think it's interesting, Mike, that you brought up Bahrain. Talk a little bit about, when you contrast Bahrain with Syria, there's not that much different except one is a friend and one is an enemy.
Well, we know Bahrain is home to a very significant major U.S. naval base and military interests in a very strategic reason. And this is why, the Arab Spring really exposed the hypocrisy of this support for human rights and democracy. That's what the United States stands for. It really put that to the test, and it really exposed to millions of people around the world the reality, where we saw, all of a sudden countries like Egypt with this, strong U.S.-backed dictator in the country, the U.S. funding this brutal military police state in the country, backed Mubarak up until the very last day, basically. And this is the Obama administration backing this brutal dictator to the very last day. Egypt, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, these countries have strategic interests for the global domination for the U.S.
All right, Mike Preisner with the Answer Coalition. Thanks, as always, for weighing in.